loose and set me free. You make me win in every way. You showed me how to spread my wings. Yes, I'm the winner of the day.
So welcome back, viewers, to our next Real Women, Real Life episode. We're really excited. We are starting to add guests to our episodes. So we're going to learn all about women across the country and across the globe with disabilities or without disabilities and how they are connecting to their community, being advocates, and all the important things related to both of our communities so we can bridge that gap between disability and able-bodied communities. So today with us, we are a little bit short on our Real Women side. A few of us unfortunately do have COVID or are unfortunately sick. So I am going to run the show today for Real Women, but we will all be back hopefully for our next recording. But with me today, I have Misha. Misha, we're super excited to have you on our show. So thank you so much for being a guest with us. Can you do me a favor and just introduce yourself to our viewers?
Sure. My name is Misha Montoya. I'm 38. I'm currently 34 weeks pregnant. I had a spinal cord injury 20 years ago, right out of high school, and I'm paraplegic. And the last several years, I've been doing disability education, public speaking, podcasts, and things like that in order to help bridge non-disabled and disabled people a bit better and break down some of the things that have been a challenge being a woman with a disability.
That's awesome. So that's really cool. So I was really excited to bring you on because you're going to be a mom with a disability, which is amazing. Do you already have children as well? Okay,
yeah.
So you are a mom with a disability and a soon-to-be mom to another, which is awesome. I have hopes of being a mom one day as well. Do you want to talk about that at all a little bit?
Sure. I have a son who's almost 12 years old, and so at the time that I had him, I was 26, and that was certainly a lot easier of a pregnancy. This pregnancy has been really hard, and there have been a lot of disability or spinal cord injury related challenges that have come up more now than last time. So it's been very challenging, but I'm excited to be nearing the end of it. I've been an ambulatory wheelchair user, so that means I've used my wheelchair for greater distances, like shopping and things like that. But then around my house or in a lot of different kind of quicker things, I use forearm crutches and a thing called AFOs, which is foot braces. And the last month or so, I've just been using my wheelchair only because my weight is like, I've gained, you could see, I've gained quite a bit of extra weight, and on my feet, I can't move anything below my knees. So, it's just kind of a lot. And then there's like a balance risk. So,
yeah, understand. So as a woman who I've always wanted to be a mom as well, and haven't had the opportunity yet, with a disability, I feel like for me, there's a lot of assumptions and I guess I would say stereotypes that the able-bodied put on women with disabilities having children. So I know for me, I'm not sure if I could physically have a child, so adoption would be an option. However, I always get the, oh, well, you need somebody to take care of you. How are you ever going to take care of a child? Have you ever kind of experienced any of that, or how do you overcome things?
Yeah, and I want to say that having done it, it is the most amazing thing because my son has been phenomenal. His ability, I noticed it kind of early on with my disability, how certain children have a way of tuning in to what you're experiencing and kind of stepping up to help you. And then also one of the big concerns, I think, when you're not as mobile is that you won't be able to run after them and keep them safe when they're in that phase of, running into traffic potentially. And what ended up happening was that my son was like never really wanted to be more than a few feet from me. When he was during that phase, he had an instinct and was really smart about risks. And, you know, I always communicated really clearly, like, this is just something I can't do, so you need to be aware of it, you know, or whatever. And from very early on, like one of the earliest things was he started opening doors for me when he was like 1 year old and had just learned how to toddle. So he started like this symbiotic relationship with me physically, moving through environments. And to this day, he is absolutely amazing at doing some of the tasks. Like both of us support each other, and he does some of the tasks that I can't quite do, and he does them very kindly. And of course, I try my best to make sure it's not too much for him and that he still gets to have, you know, his childhood and not have it just be like caretaking. But he really enjoys, you know, they love their parents, and he's really thriving. And also, you know, I've always talked to him a lot about like if he were to get teased, having a disabled mom, or how he could be resilient around that. And I don't think he actually ever has, but I know for sure he's been like, I started going into classrooms from kindergarten on and talking to the kids and having them, you know, be able to ask me questions about my injury and my disability, and normalizing it as much as I could for them. And then I started working with like directors. I worked with a director of his current school to bring more disability education into the classrooms, like diversifying their literature that the little kids have, and making sure there's books with and that there's representation of disability in their environment. And I just knew that if anybody, because I had kind of coached him, like if anybody had teased him, he would be able to be like, well, you know, you just don't understand, or, you know, she's not less valuable just because she gets around like that, or whatever.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, that's amazing. I think it's so neat how, like, I teach children, I teach fourth grade at my church, and they're just so inquisitive. They want to know, and they're so helpful. They're like, oh, you need a drink? Oh, do you want me to grab this for you? And I'm like, no, I can do it, but okay. Like, so it's just amazing how they're so open to it that they just see no difference, which I think is so neat. What about kind of going out and being like out on the town? How do you kind of combat those feelings? Like, I know for some of our viewers, there's those feelings of what other people say, or as they walk by and they stare, or what's that resilience look like for you?
So that's the biggest piece for me that I love to talk about with this, because before I understood what ableism was and how it manifested, I was kind of having like internalized ableism happen for me. And unfortunately, I didn't feel that when I initially had my injury. I still felt like totally whole, and you know, I just had a sort of different experience where I didn't feel like my identity came from what I did. And so losing the things that I did wasn't as hard on me as it could have been if my identity had been wrapped up in it. But through receiving the ableist messaging for so many years that I was broken, or that I was like asexual, or that I was like a child, or all these different kind of unconscious cultural messages that we get, I was starting to have a harder time with all of that. And then I did disability studies just independently, and that was the most liberating thing I've done mentally post-injury. And all of a sudden I just remembered and I understood what was going on in those interactions socially, and somehow that understanding freed me from so much of it. And then I sort of stepped into this role of education because it felt so unnecessary. Like most non-disabled people don't want to be doing that stuff, but they have no idea. And then most disabled people are just carrying around this huge burden that every time we go out into public, we have to be fielding, you know, this discriminatory behavior.
Right.
And So it's been really empowering for me. And I find that I prefer to address it on bigger platforms like a podcast or to groups, because it can be tiring to try to deal with it on a one-to-one basis.
Right.
So, through writing and things like that, I process the experiences that I have. But I just had an experience where it was because of COVID lockdowns. I had been in my house, and because of the pregnancy so much. And so I went out to IKEA to go shopping for the first time in a really long time in public, and just a few hours out in public. And it was like several experiences, like strangers asking you very personal questions, servers treating you like you're 6 years old. There was some other thing that happened, and so then I just write about it, and I just try to help people see it. And it's little by little, I think the more we do that, as we're resourced to and as we're motivated to, the more we can change things.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because ableism is kind of a big topic. It's been a big topic for the last couple of years now, and some of us have a good understanding of what ableism is, some of us not so much, because we don't even realize like that's what's going on. And I think the best approach to ableism is really just kind of being that educator, right? Because a lot of times able-bodied people really don't mean what they say in a mean way. They just really have no idea how to ask, or how to talk about whatever they have brought up. And we just did a conversation not too long ago about being open to questions. So, as a person with a disability, are you open to answering questions? And what does that, if you're not, then how does that kind of portray back to somebody who doesn't have a disability? Then are they never going to ask any more questions, and do assumptions continue from there? So it's just an interesting kind of like combination of opinions, because I think everybody's is really different.
Yeah. And I think for each of us too, depending on the point in the day, it's different, or like, yeah, sometimes you're in the middle of a moment that's like stressful, just like anybody. And then somebody wants to come up and be like, what's wrong with you? Or what happened to you? And it's just not the right time. Or, being out at a bar with your friend, or I don't know, somewhere like out at a social event with your friend. It's not necessarily a time like you want to be asked about your disability, but there's not always a lot of finesse around it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I love that you're teaching. So we're going to kind of backtrack, because you had mentioned something about bringing in resources into the school so that there was more diversity, inclusion conversations that were happening. Do you have a certain books you like to take in with you that you recommend, like anything like that, resource wise, that we can share? Maybe other people that watch would want to do the same thing in their classrooms.
Yeah, there's awesome resources. I was just looking at some yesterday, and I could maybe send you a list because that would be a little easier. But
Yeah,
I know that I came across a package that was like inclusivity training for schools. And in there was a collection of like 10 to 15 books for early childhood education that had to do with disability. And those seemed like just a great resource,
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be a lot of talk right now. At least kind of in my world and in my job, we've added the diversity and inclusion committees and all of these things. And so now we're seeing all these books, books about race, books about gender, books about disabilities. And it's like, oh, your child should read all of these books. And I'm like, these books have been around for so long, but now we're just starting to read them. So it's so different how times have changed and conversations have shifted.
Yeah, not everyone, but there is sort of a readiness for this right now.
Yeah, so let's kind of shift to your public speaking side. What's kind of your go-to for public speaking, or what do those topics look like in conversations?
I typically hit some of the biggest things in the past, and I think it'd be fun to get into some other stuff sometime soon, but I have been talking just about ableism, what is ableism, some of the biggest ways that it manifests. Mm-hmm. And then I talk about, inspiration porn, helping people to understand that and how to try to avoid that. I think that's the main thing. And then oftentimes I tell my story of my injury and how it was a lot different than what people assume. And what a lot of people that have a spinal cord injury experience, it turns out a lot of them do really suffer it, but I didn't have that experience. So it was really abrasive to me to be met with that projection all the time. But yeah, mainly just focusing on ableism, and it usually takes up enough, and then Q&A, where people can then kind of feel safe to ask their questions that might be kind of taboo, or that they might not feel, comfortable asking. That's kind of my favorite part, is when people feel safe enough to get into that.
Yeah. And I think that's where most of the education comes from too, and helping to bring the awareness. So in our last, we have about 15 minutes to wrap up, but did you want to share any part of your story, or any part of kind of your transition to disability or anything like that?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's what I want to talk about. I just basically had, my injury happened. I had grown up in the Yosemite area in California, Mariposa specifically, and we grew up climbing and being pretty outdoorsy. And right after high school, I was climbing a tree, and the branch I was on broke, and I fell and had my injury. I had a burst fracture at L1, and then spent about 2.5 months in the hospital doing, rehab. I never moved my feet again after the injury. So my ankles or toes, I can feel everything. That is one thing that I talk about a little bit too, is like an incomplete injury means you can have some motor and sensory function below the level of injury. So, and then that can look completely different person from person. So
Right.
For me, I have almost all of the sensation, but I have none. I have, less mobility in those areas that are affected by paralysis. So it's like I can feel my feet almost the same, but I can't move them. And that seems to be a thing that a lot of people don't have a lot of comprehension of regarding spinal cord injury, or that you could have the opposite, or, whatever.
Right.
And so, yeah, for me, I had a sort of spiritual experience in the hospital that was really powerful. And I feel like overall my life has been one that has been focusing more on like inner growth and the inner experience. And so the injury was able to become like a catalyst for basically learning some really huge lessons about where true power comes from, that it doesn't come from force, that it comes from surrender, and it doesn't come from will. My will was very, very, very honed and strong. And nevertheless, when it comes to life and death and some of these bigger matters in life, we're powerless. And just to let go and accept that was liberating. And I felt intense peace and intense bliss that really carried me through a long time. And then and it was nothing like anything I'd ever experienced before. And so I was always pretty grateful. I was like, well, the cost was really high for what I experienced, but it also was like nothing compared to what I got in return, basically.
Right. Yeah. I love learning about people who more transition into having a disability. So I was born with mine. So I've never had the experience of walking, or I've never done any of that. I've been in a wheelchair since I was 4. And that's only because I got too heavy and my parents couldn't carry me anymore. And so growing up, it was a lot different, kindergarten in a wheelchair. Everybody's like, I don't know what that is, but okay, and getting picked on here and there and being bullied every once in a while because you look a lot different. And it was the same thing for me. It took a long time for me to understand that I wasn't never going to walk. I just can't with my disability, unfortunately. And it was a spiritual movement for me as well, because I had to realize that what I've been given in the life I have was so much greater than the wants that I had that weren't going to happen. And so that's something that I think a lot of us on the Wheel Women team are really proud of, like our faith and our acceptance of our disability, because it kind of keeps you going. It's like that behind motivation that just pushes you forward to go out and achieve and to, empower others and continue to advocate, because we're who we are and we have to live life we've at least been given and be grateful for what we have. And so I just think it's an important part. So I appreciate you sharing, that part of your story, because I think that's so empowering for others to hear. Because accepting your disability takes time for each of us, regardless if we're born with it or not. And so, some of us, it's a lot faster, and some of us, it's a lot slower. But it's a process, that each one of us goes through. And so it's just such a unique process that it's nice to be able to shed light on some of what that looks like. Is there anything else that I haven't asked or haven't touched on that you do want to talk about?
What you just said makes me remember something interesting, I think, about my process, which has been, and thanks for sharing that. I love talking to other people that and learning, so anyway, but I was going to say, for me, it was interesting because there was this sort of slow process, because I had been able to do certain things. For instance, I remember skiing. I grew up skiing, and it was like one of the most incredible experiences. And so in order for me to transition into like adaptive skiing was really hard psychologically, because I had to go through the day where I really experienced in my body what it was like to not be able to freely move on the snow. And, it's like each new thing that I tried to do post-injury that I had done pre-injury was like also going through psychological terrain. And so even though I had this broader umbrella of acceptance, there was like battles to overcome on these like micro levels, bit by bit. And I only took those as I could handle them, and then I would break through, and then I would be like, okay, this is my new experience. I ski on a mono ski, or I ski on a 4-track skiing, or, and then I could focus on it as the gift that it was, in contrast to nothing versus what I had experienced. So that was like a journey, absolutely. And I will say too, I've heard a lot of disabled people that have had their disabilities happen from an injury, say that, like, say they have a near-death experience, then everything that they get back is a gift.
Right.
Whereas lots of people see it from the other way, as a loss, like, oh, yeah. And so that's kind of an important thing that I think, was absolutely my experience. Like, oh, because I shattered my right elbow, and it was like, oh, I can still, lift my son, or who knows what, and it was such a gift, instead of like, oh, it hurts in there or something,
Yeah, I think it's those little things. I always say, we take the little things for granted. You catch the able-bodied population doing this all the time. For me, it takes me 15 minutes to brush my teeth in the morning, but because I can do it by myself, I'm like, yes, I brushed my teeth today. But the person next to me is like, I don't even think about it. I just brush my teeth, And so it's those little things that you're just like, no, I'm so thankful for, the small movement I do have today, or the fact that I could get a drink of water by myself. Those little victories are so important, and they really help with your mindset as you're learning to accept, your disability and kind of what factors you have to play with throughout life. The mindset shifts, and you're like, okay, it's not as bad as it is when, other people mention this or say that this, or, things like that. So that's just it's a really kind of neat way to think. It's fun talking to somebody else that thinks the same way, though. Doesn't happen all the time.
It feels so important to like relish life and the experience of it, and to really be like, for me, like be slowed down so much, instead of being able to run around distracted and wondering what my purpose is, or just all the things I see. It's like, no, it's just experiencing and being so grateful for absolutely everything that we get to experience. And of course, that's hard when you're having like chronic pain. And I certainly have a really hard time with it sometimes. But in general, I think that's the gift that it can give, is like really knowing the value of like your finger, or, whatever.
Yeah, for sure. And the value of time, I think, just because it takes us longer to do things, somebody can speed past 5 tasks and I'm still on task number 1. But I may see something totally different than the person who already did 15 tasks ahead of me did. So I think our value of time is just different, but it's just really neat to see both sides. So as we kind of wrap up here, any final thoughts or words of encouragement or any types of tips or anything you'd like to leave our viewers with today?
Well, the only thing is, thanks for this opportunity. And I guess the best tip I can give is just what helped me the most, which was doing disability studies. And, there was a couple books like Critiques, which was disabled women authors. And of course, recently there was like Sitting Pretty, and I love her writing. And then, I listened to like the Disability History of the United States, the audiobook, because it's very long, and just a few things like that. And it really helped me so much with understanding ableism, which has been the most liberating thing. So that's my best advice.
That's awesome. So we'll make sure we include the links to some of those things as we put the podcast up, so that way people can find those resources. And then we'll also link to your pages. So I know you and I are connected on Facebook, but if you wanted to connect with anybody, maybe people have questions about bringing inclusion into classrooms, things like that, we'd love to have you as a resource as well. So we can include those ways to get a hold of you if you want to send this to me when we're done. That would be great. But we really enjoyed having you. So thank you so much for being a part. I do apologize we're not all here tonight, but I was glad I got to have the conversation with you. And so good luck on your final weeks of pregnancy. Hopefully, everything goes well, and we will definitely stay connected, and maybe we can do another one soon, so we can have all the girls meet you as well. So we would love to have that.
Yeah, I'd love that. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a good rest of your night.
Me too.